It was rare to walk alone on the street of a space station, but the drone quietly sweeping the floor was the only other here tonight. I wandered past the empty stores and forgotten developments, headed for the end of the road. There, through the armored glass, was a fine view of Earth itself, the maiden home, slowly spinning beneath us. Possibly the best view on the entire station, and I was savoring it alone. An entire arm of one of the grandest space stations ever built, dedicated just to us. The space's reward, never paid for, always maintained, and always empty. I delayed for a while longer, before finally turning and heading towards my goal. As I closed, the music from within got louder. Guitar and vocals, something simple. A clear sign that my generation was not the majority tonight. The entrance was as nondescript as ever, designed in such a way that only those who knew where to find it could. Which may have worked if it wasn't the only thing with the faintest hint of life in this entire station arm. As I pushed open the door to the bar and let the sound out into the empty street, I missed the soothing harsh beats and synth of my youth. How long ago was that now? Such thoughts were quickly forgotten as the familiar ride of clothes, accents and styles washed over me. To my left was a sight I recognized, the leather-clad camis reach. Their rockabilly get-up something of a normality compared to what other spaces preferred. I headed right instead, unbuckling my holster as I did. Behind the bar stood Tender, his metal hand already outstretched and waiting for my gun.
Greetings, Yuri. You are 34 days ahead of schedule.
The same greeting, every time, the only variation being the adjustment of the days. Tender was an old model, with a basic AI somewhere in his brain bucket. Last time I made port, I had heard there were AI leading research divisions now. One had even been elected to rule one of the outer colonies. And yet, we stuck with Tender, whose most impressive skill was learning a new joke every few decades. He tucked my gun away beneath the bar, turning around to find a clean glass to fill. There were piles of guns of all sorts, from companies long since bankrupt to brand new gyro guns that were all a rage according to the spaceport billboards. The bar worked under a strict rule of leaving your grievances at the door, but switched to a more practical method, after the son of a Valconi terrorist came back from a supply run to find his father's revolution failed and his world under the boot of the Colval Corporation. The son took his fury out on a spacer who hadn't seen his boss at Colval in over 40 years. The story goes that the boss, the commander of the occupation, and the father were all long dead and buried by the time that son put a bullet in the spacer's head. But it's not like any of us could prove that legend right or wrong. I rested against the bar, next to someone clad in reflective gear, head to toe. Their helmet still on. Maybe they'd been caught in a decomp and hadn't gotten over the fear. But they weren't going to be a good drinking partner. As soon as Tender returned, I scooped up my drink and headed for the long table that dominated the center of the bar. While many clustered the side tables in their cruise groups, the center was the place where those who actually wanted to enjoy themselves went. A woman with a cybernetic arm was telling the tale of how she'd gotten it, using the two robotic tendrils appearing from her upper back to act out the fight, in which she claimed to have lost her arm. Across from her was an old friend of mine, the stout James of Buller, a world with what I'd call crushing gravity, resulting in the short, stocky man that was currently downing a bright green drink with a floral umbrella dancing in it. Even he could break tradition. His crew, that of the Unbreakable too, sat next to him, so I took a seat between the robo-freaks and a group I'd considered joining a few months ago. The crew of the Rover. Tricorn hats and clothes considered ancient even among spacers. These crazy bastards were the ones making blind runs out to the stars, for no other reason than to see what awaited them, pushing their drive to its limits out to the furthest reaches, before coming back again. Of course, there was no pay in it. The colonies needed supply runs, data couriers, technological updates, not news of new worlds that the leaders of each would never live to see. What finally turned me off from joining them was their constant talk of the cure. One day, they say, we'll find it. Aliens, or a new element, a better drive, will save us all. It was a fast track to the rest of the bar turning sour and ignoring the Rover crew until the next night cycle. Anyone who'd been a spacer for more than a few months knew it was a hopeless voyage, destined for disappointment. Better to live as we do than to suffer their blind optimism. Despite those cruel words, I greeted the leader with a lift of my glass and a smile. New hat, I see. And the ritualistic reply.
I found it.
Our dance complete, I turned to James of Buller, who had stolen one of his crewmates' drinks in the time I'd been distracted. Not that it mattered. Every one of us in this bar was richer than we had any right to be. Or perhaps because we had every right to be. Ships were a cost that only corporations or full crews could afford. But if there was anything down in the maiden home I wanted, it could be mine. The hardest part was wanting something.
Oh, alone again, Yuri? Has your crew finally decided to prefer the brothel over real human contact?
James of Buller grinned, his face partially hidden by a mug that a vengeful crewmate was currently attempting to take back. You're one to speak, half-human. A reply that drew a laugh from James of Buller as the mug was finally reclaimed. In truth, my crew this time were fresh and new, children practically, though they were only 4 years younger than I at my tender age of 23. And yet, I had seen the centuries before they were born. Right now, they weren't chasing the working girls with their fresh pay. They were curled up on the floor of our ship's common room, screaming, crying, and tearing at their hair as the messages that had been sent decades ago finally arrived, and the reality of what they had done hit them. Perhaps I was wrong to leave them like that, and come here instead, but I'm no good at dealing with people in that state. Hell, after flying for so long, I'm not sure I'm good at dealing with people at all. Jaded, exhausted, and used to it now. They'll recover soon and either desert this ship, or their resolve will harden, and soon I'll see them in this bar, as if they'd been drinking here since 2164. It had only been a 2-month supply run out to the colony of Gilgamesh, and then 2 months back with their recent discoveries aboard. We did as spacers do, and pushed our ship to the speed of light, as close as we could get. And by the time we returned, the world had changed. As the banter between myself and James of Buller was overruled by a fresh arrival wearing powered armor from a war that had ended 80 years ago, my view shifted to the back wall of the bar. Next to the big window giving us all a view of the maiden home we could never return to, there was a wall of clocks. Some spaces had given it fancier names, but in the end the names for it were as different as our clothing styles. Every clock had a name above it: Farewell to Maidenhome, Heartbeat, Starblazer, Volcani's Legacy, Enterprise, Last One Out. And my new ship, no regrets. I'd wish I'd known back when I named it that every other bastard in the bar would just shorten it to regret. Every clock displayed a different time and date, the most recent one a time around 36 years ago. Even the seconds ticked at a different rate per clock, the walls softly pulsing in a strange wave that got far more fun to look at the drunker you were. Above all of them sat the one clock I never liked looking at. Earth. Turns out my supply run to Gilgamesh cost the young men of my crew 20 years. An intense desire to repeat a stunt from a year and a half ago came over me. Get drunk beyond belief, and then climb up the wall to try and pull down the Earth clock. Last time it was James of Buller that defeated my attempt, slapped some sense into me, and spent the rest of the night finishing my alcohol. My scheming was interrupted by the arrival of another warrior, his power armor looking battle-scarred and burnt compared to the pristine suit of the current boasting man. It was only when he sat opposite the other warrior that I realized his armor wasn't burnt, but rather of a darker camouflage. The rest of the spacers had picked up on this too, as talk at the table quietened, and people shifted, ready to move. The boisterous warrior was the last to fall silent, matching the gaze of the new arrival, who spoke first.
You owe me a drink.
Those words sent out a wave of relief, and the chatter returned as the two warriors, one victorious and one defeated, both removed their helmets and shared a drink. Perhaps they were both aware that whatever victory had been won was likely already forgotten by all save for themselves. I traded words with the other crews while I drained my glass, feeling almost human again as friends arrived, shared drinks and stories, and then left to head out to the stars once more. I was turning to go get a new drink when I saw a rather unusual sight at the bar. An old man had just shuffled in the doorway, a walker pushed out in front of him as he slowly stepped his way towards the bar. The spaces there moved aside to allow him access. That crew wore jumpsuits, looking like professional fighter pilots. Any grounder would be forgiven for thinking they were the newest and most modern crew, but a real spacer knew anyone dressed like that was likely from the original generation, back when the drive was first pushed into service. More and more eyes fell on the old man. Old spacers were not a common sight, between the high desertion and danger cutting many lives short. But more than that, the drives had simply not been around for the thousands of years that they would need to be to produce an old spacer. No, most old spacers were merely old men who had realized their time was soon approaching and took to the stars to try to outrun it. Not that any of that mattered. The old man was not a spacer. He moved with the weight of the world upon him, with cares, needs, a connection to this solar system that the ghost that parted way for him lacked. He shuffled closer to the bar, Tender moving over towards him as he asked loudly,
Is he here?
I immediately discarded plans for a refill, turning away from the bar and leaning forwards on the long table. I felt every pair of eyes along the table turn from the old man and burn into me instead, so I hung my head, waiting for it to end. Tender replied in the same monotone as always.
No, sir, he is not. I'm afraid this is a bar for spacers. I will have to ask you to leave.
A tired groan arose from a few others around me, letting me know that this conversation had happened many times before. The old man protested.
I will leave when you tell me where my father is.
Your father is out in the colonies on a supply run.
The bartender replied, and then pointed to the door.
I will call you if he returns.
The old man cursed the metal bartender, calling him the sort of names that would make the robotic crew by the door blush, were they able. A man of his age not meant to use such foul language. He slowly turned, shuffling his way out of the bar. No one watched him go. They were still watching me. I could feel it. This continued until I couldn't take it anymore, and I rose, headed over to the bar. I held out my drink for Tender to refill, silent. I'd hoped that this time, when I returned, he would be gone. Perhaps I was 34 days early. As Tender finished refilling my drink, he spoke up in the same monotone that had just dismissed my son.
16 years ago, I was talking to a spacer who finally explained what you are.
The bar's atmosphere was still on hold, watching as I was talked down to by an ancient robot that each spacer in here could afford a legion of, if there was even a company still producing them.
You're a coward.
Tender asserted, and I swear I could hear the faintest level of emotion in his voice as he learnt something new. I took my drink, headed to a side table as the judgment was laid on me. Slowly, the bar started up again as I sat alone and drank. Next time I return, that old man will be gone. Next time, I'll return to the way a spacer should be. Timeless, unchanging, with no connections to reality left. A ship and a crew, adventures and stories, and not a single person left to care about when we push our ships to the speed of light, flying so fast that we break the barrier of time, watching as humanity evolves beneath us but never returning, roaming far and wide before returning to the only place we truly feel alive, the bar at the end of time.